In the quiet darkness, when the normal sounds have subsided, there are hidden things that the naked eye cannot see. Secrets, fears, and wandering souls still linger in the air. Prepare yourself, because the story you are about to hear will take you on a journey to the darkest places of the human soul, where truth is sometimes scarier than fiction. Story 1. Horror Doll. On Halloween night about 7 years ago, when everything had calmed down and the atmosphere became quiet, there were no more children's laughter or the sound of neighbors' Halloween tapes. Only my cousin and I remained. Q sat in the living room. All the kids in the neighborhood had long since returned home, and even our neighbors across the street had turned off their corny Halloween tapes with creaking doors and the witches' giggles. The living room became quiet, the light from the candles dancing on the walls, reflecting the warm yellow light from the single table lamp. My little cousin, only about 4 years old, left her doll lying face down on the floor. It's a baby olive doll or something similar, with incredibly realistic details. This doll once made my cousin feel uncomfortable as soon as it was purchased. She hated it so much that she often threw it down the basement stairs. Even though I didn't feel any problem with it, the girl kept screaming about how scary the doll was, so it remained there on the floor, untouched, so my cousin could pick it up the next morning. About half an hour passed in silence, until I started hearing a strange noise, like heavy footsteps from outside the window. This sound was very distinct, not like the usual noise of the wind or swaying tree branches, but the sound of an elderly person shuffling almost right outside the window. I turned to Q and asked, "Did you hear that?" Q, still glued to her computer screen, just shook her head and said she didn't hear anything. Maybe it was the sound of a neighbor's Halloween tape, she assumed, and returned to her work. The strange noise was silent for a minute, but then got louder again, as if someone was trying to say something. I stood up, walked to the window, and looked out. The scene outside was a pitch-black night, with no light from the street or the neighbors' houses, only dark trees rising in the darkness. There's no one out there. I returned to the sofa and motioned to Q, but she said nothing. I almost went crazy with the silence and doubt. Another minute passed, and this time the whispering became clearer, sounding like a child's voice combined with a woman's voice. Q finally looked up from the computer, his eyes glancing over the doll lying still on the floor. She looked at it in disbelief, thinking maybe it was the doll making strange sounds. She was very superstitious, and I didn't believe in the paranormal. I decided to go down and pick up the doll. Even though it had no battery, I put it back in place, hoping that would be the end of it. I sat back on the sofa, and immediately, the strange hissing noise started again. The noise appeared to originate from a man, and was followed by wheezing. I jumped up from my chair, worried that the sound was coming from the backyard. As I started to walk away, I noticed the doll had moved a little. Its eyes were wide open, and it seemed heavier than before. Anxiety overwhelmed me, and I threw the doll into the basement again, telling myself that maybe it was just a coincidence. But fear cannot be erased, and that Halloween night left a scary mark on my mind. I didn't know what to think about what happened, and from then on, I never looked at that doll again. The quiet evenings and quiet darkness of the neighborhood became colder than ever, and the doll's strange presence still haunts me to this day. Story 2. Black Shadows by the Window. On a cold and quiet night, when everything around me had fallen into the stillness of the night, I was sitting alone in my bedroom. My room is on the first floor, and because I live in a secluded area with lots of trees, I have never installed curtains for the windows. I usually like to let natural light shine into my room when I wake up, but on this night the lack of curtains made me feel deeply regretful. When I turned off the reading light and lay down to rest, the room fell into an eerie silence. Suddenly, I heard a strange sound like the light tapping of someone's fist coming from the window. The sound was not a tree branch rubbing against the glass, but a clear and steady tapping sound, as if someone was deliberately banging on the window. I stood up and turned to face the window, but saw nothing but thick darkness. My heart pounded, and fear spread through my body like a violent wave. I tried to convince myself that maybe it was just a branch, but when a second knock sounded, the sound clearer and stronger. I had no more doubts. This was not the sound of a tree branch, but a solid punch hitting the window glass. I started thinking that if I ignored the sound, maybe the person would leave. Maybe it was just a thug looking to cause trouble. I decided not to react and hoped that the person would get bored and go away. But when the fourth knock sounded, my patience ran out. I feel like I need to face this person even though I don't know what awaits me. I turned to the window again, and immediately I saw a dark shadow quickly move under the window. Fear surged through me like a tidal wave, and I rushed to the kitchen to call the police. When I called, the police promised to send an officer within 10 minutes. I hung up the phone with an overwhelming feeling of fear and tension. As soon as I turned around, I felt something in the corner of my eye. I turned my head and saw someone standing outside my kitchen window. His silhouette was blurred in the weak light, but it was only a second before he disappeared from my sight. Panic surged through me when I received a phone call from my best friend and neighbor. He had seen through his window 3 men dressed in black enter my house earlier, one of them carrying a shiny, sharp object. This made my fear even more intense. With no time to think, I decided to run upstairs and hide in the bathroom. I felt like I was being watched through all the windows, and the constant knocking downstairs only added to my panic. I know for sure that it wasn't the police, because they didn't arrive in time. I can only pray that they come before things get worse. Luckily, after the knocking stopped, I heard a loud banging at the front door, followed by a loud shout of police when I opened the door. I saw police officers standing in front of me, but the 3 men had already left into the woods. Although the police carried out an extensive search, they could find no clues about the 3 people. They only knew that they had disappeared into the darkness, leaving me with indelible fear and confusion. These feelings still haunt me, like an unforgettable night in my memory. Story 3. Strange Friend. One particularly stressful week, when my parents had just divorced, I moved in with my dad. I was an only child, and this change made me feel alone and deprived. Returning to my new house, I felt lost and strange. The only time I was close to other children was when I went out to play with them. A boy named Tom, who lived on the corner of my block, became my first close friend during this time. We first met when I was riding my bike around the neighborhood. Tom, who was much older than me, actively invited me in to take photos. 12-year-old me was intrigued and agreed, not knowing that this would be the start of a terrifying chain of events. Tom, 16 years old, looks much more mature than his age. Initially, Tom seemed very friendly and pleasant. We often called and played games together, and I felt excited about this new friendship. However, that comfort did not last long. Gradually, Tom's behavior becomes increasingly strange. He started calling constantly if I didn't answer, leaving annoying messages and often coming to my house, ringing the bell even when my dad wasn't home. I shared my worries with my dad, but he still forced me to go out with Tom, making me feel like I had no choice but to continue this encounter. One day, Tom invited me into his house. Even though I didn't really want to go in, it felt like I had no other choice. When I entered Tom's house, a disgusting stench immediately filled my lungs. Dirty clothes were thrown all over the floor, broken glass was mixed in a corner of the room, and coffee-like stains on the walls created a scene that was both dirty and disgusting. The feeling that I was entering another world made me feel nervous. At that moment, a large man with a shady appearance walked out from another room. His eyes were cold and scary, as if I was being watched from afar. Tom introduced him as his father, but the man just grumbled at me and stomped into another room. Everything in this house makes me feel threatened. I felt this was a scary situation and decided I didn't want to stay in that house any longer. I made up an excuse to leave, saying I forgot a doctor's appointment. As I prepared to leave, the smile on Tom's face gradually faded, replaced by an unhappy, almost extremely angry expression. He didn't say anything, just looked at me with a scary stare. I quickly ran out of the house, along the block to my house, feeling like there were millions of eyes watching me. When I got home, I discovered the door was locked. I used the key my dad gave me and walked in, only to find that Dad wasn't home. On the refrigerator, I found a note that my dad had to go to work because of a possible storm emergency. That night, before going to bed, I checked my email and noticed about 5 new emails, all with capital letters in the subject line. It was all sent from an email address named tomtom20@old.com -- that's right, Tom. I never gave him my email and don't understand how he got it. One of the emails was titled "You're Mistaken" and another was titled "I Know Where You Live," while the rest were filled with profanities and threats. I was only 12 years old and felt extremely scared. I decided to call my dad, but as I walked to the phone in the kitchen, I heard the rustling of the bushes outside. My heart pounded as I opened the window curtains and the face of a large man appeared. I immediately recognized it as Tom's dad. A feeling of fear shook me as I called the police. When they arrived, he was gone. My father returned home earlier than expected and immediately obtained a restraining order against Tom and his father. About a month later, Tom and his father moved out, and I was moved into a new house that my aunt and uncle had rented. Those terrifying experiences still haunt me, and even though I have a safer place to live, the fear and feeling of being watched never completely disappear from my mind. Story 4. Mysterious Sounds. A few months after moving in alone, a friend of mine from work asked if I was looking for a roommate. I thought about it for a while and finally agreed to let him move in. My apartment has 2 bedrooms with a small office in the garage. He decided he wanted his own space, so he moved his stuff into his garage office. This was a rather strange setup, but he ran into a problem. There was no bathroom or kitchen out there, so he had to use the kitchen and toilet inside the house. We have different work schedules, so I often leave the house unlocked for him to come in when I'm out. One night when I got home from dinner at my girlfriend's house, I decided to grab the 6 cans of beer I had bought the day before. When I opened the refrigerator, I saw that my beer was gone. I immediately thought my roommate had taken them without asking. Blind anger made me rush out to the garage and bang on his bedroom door. He was sleeping, and when I yelled at him about my beer disappearing, he rubbed his eyes, rolled over, and said he didn't touch my beer. He lived with me for a while, and I'm pretty good at recognizing when people are lying. I feel like he's telling the truth. But my heart sank when I realized that someone had stolen our beer and possibly other things. We went back to the house and checked everything to see if anything was missing. The TV was still there. The furniture was unchanged. But when I went into the bedroom, I realized my $2,000 laptop was gone. We panicked. My friend called the police immediately. We searched everywhere, from the house to the yard, hoping to find the lost laptop or beer. The house is not ours. Previously, it had an additional room built a few years after the main house was built. My aunt's dying mother lived there in her final years. After she passed away, my aunt and uncle rented that room to a strange woman. She behaved strangely, and we often hear strange noises from the back of the house throughout the night. Then her brother moved in, which also made us feel suspicious. One night, as her brother was sitting outside in the driveway smoking, I noticed that he seemed strange. Although he didn't recognize me when I pulled up, he stared at me with eyes full of curiosity. During the search for the thief, he even asked my roommate if he could give him drugs. We started noticing bare tracks in the snow leading from their door to our garage door. Once we connected all the dots, we knocked on their door and asked them to open the door. Someone inside lifted the curtain and looked into my eyes. The sight gave me chills. The police came and took our information. They checked the house but found nothing and no one. They examined the footprints and explained that the people living here were probably drug addicts. We gave them the names of the officers, and when we returned, the police informed us that the man had an arrest warrant in another province and had been convicted of breaking and entering before. They knocked on the man's door for several minutes and identified themselves as police, but to no avail. Because the arrest warrant came from another province and legally the man had not committed a local crime, the police could do nothing more and left. At 1 o'clock in the morning, when my roommate and I were getting ready to go to bed, I remembered that the door connecting the 2 parts of the house could only be locked from their side of the room. I completely forgot about this. As I was falling asleep, I heard footsteps outside my door and a series of loud bangs as my doorknob began to shake violently. I was barely awake and hurriedly checked. Luckily, my roommate, who slept through the night and didn't get up to go to the bathroom, wasn't the one making the noise. My heart sank when I heard this. I told my roommate about what happened during the night. My silly childhood fear of leaving my bedroom door open made me feel unsafe. We never know what might happen if I leave the door open, and that man comes into my room. Needless to say, my roommate and I moved out of that apartment a few weeks later, leaving everything behind. Story 5. Man in the Dark. On my friend's 21st birthday, we had a big party with lots of alcohol. The house is filled with laughter and music, with up to 100 people attending. In the chaos, I noticed an older man sitting quietly in the corner of the room. He just watched people drinking and dancing. At first, I didn't think much about it, just thought maybe he was someone's father or uncle. When night fell and most of the guests had left, the man was still sitting there alone in the corner of the room. I asked a friend if he knew who he was, but he didn't. We decided to wait and see if he was gone when the last customer left. When the party was over and the house was left with only friends staying over, we returned to the living room and found he was no longer there. I felt relieved, even though the house wasn't mine, and the man seemed completely out of place. That night, I decided to sleep on the couch in the office. Alcohol makes me fall asleep easily, but that doesn't mean I sleep peacefully. Around midnight, I woke up feeling extremely thirsty and needed to go to the bathroom. I went to the bathroom first because it was closer, then went to the kitchen to get a glass of water. When I returned to the den and lay down on the couch, I noticed the sliding door to the coat closet across from the couch had opened slightly. The darkness inside the closet made it impossible for me to see clearly, but the image of that scary man sitting in the corner of the room appeared in my mind. My heart felt cold when I thought that maybe that man had secretly hidden in the closet. I lay still, not daring to move, feeling like someone was watching me through the open closet door. I began planning my escape, carefully calculating each step. I could jump over the couch and run up the stairs to the living room where my friends were. Just as I was about to carry out my plan, the closet door slid open a little more. That's when I couldn't hesitate any longer. I jumped over the couch and ran up the stairs. I could hear the cabinet door sliding open completely and someone running after me. I shouted loudly at my friends sitting on the chair, waking up all three of them. They looked at me like I was crazy, but I knew that we now outnumbered that man 4-1. I looked up the stairs and waited, but he never appeared. My friends asked for an explanation, and I told them about the creepy man I thought was hiding in the coat closet. At that moment, we heard the back door open from below the office. We stood up, looking at each other worriedly. We called the police, but when they arrived, there was no trace of the man left. It seemed he had left through the back door, leaving us with an uneasy feeling and a sleepless night. In the end, even though we didn't find him, the fear and anxiety didn't leave me. The feeling of a stranger invading my personal space made me never feel completely safe again. Story 6. Strange Encounter. When I was in college in North Carolina, I started working at a TJ Maxx store to make extra money, since I had to go to school during the day. My work often lasts until late at night. One night, I finished my shift and started out to the parking lot to head home. It was about 11 or 11:30 p.m. According to store regulations, all employees must leave together, and security guards will stand on the sidewalk to ensure that we all get on safely. As I approached my car, I heard a car stop behind. I turned around and saw a woman sitting in the driver's seat and a teenage daughter in the passenger seat. The woman rolled down the window and started telling me the story that they had just come into town to visit family, and now they were out of gas and had no money. She asked if I could lend them a few dollars to buy gas. I honestly replied that I didn't bring any cash. She just looked at me expectantly and immediately asked if I could get in the car with them to the gas station and buy them about $10 worth of gas. Even though I immediately refused, she continued to ask many times. Finally, I had to make it clear that I couldn't help them. Only then did I notice my daughter sitting in the passenger seat. She was staring at me with scary eyes, licking her lips and wriggling her fingers strangely. A feeling of coldness and insecurity enveloped me. I decided to go back to the store, where a security guard was standing to protect our safety because their car had stopped right behind mine. I knew that if they wanted to follow me, I would be stuck there. When I turned around, the security guard saw I looked nervous and started walking toward their car. Immediately, the woman and her daughter rushed away, leaving me with a feeling of horror and anxiety. I felt like I had just escaped a dangerous situation, and I couldn't help but think that if the security guard hadn't arrived in time, the situation could have become much more serious. After the incident, I couldn't sleep peacefully all night, always feeling uneasy from that girl's eyes and the hasty way they left. Story 7. Ghost in the Building. When I worked the night shift in a large office building, the feeling of loneliness is inevitable. It's a strange loneliness when you're the only person left on the entire work floor, in a large building where most of the lights are turned off and there's no one around. Although it might make me feel more peaceful and less stressed, I always sense a vague uneasiness in the air. One Friday night, at around 2 a.m., while I was concentrating on typing on the keyboard, I suddenly heard a strange noise coming from outside my office. The sound sounded like a random crack from the walls or something unusual in the building, but I didn't feel too worried and tried to continue my work. Just a moment later, the next sound made me lift my head, the sound of the computer starting up. At that time, I felt something was not right. I'm sure no one else is working the night shift at the moment, and the presence of the computer booting up is a suspicious sign. I stood up from my chair, trying to see past the walls of the room, and the glare from the computer screen in the darkness of a room on the other side caught my attention. Overwhelmed by feelings of curiosity and anxiety, I did something I regretted later. I shouted loudly into the darkness, asking if anyone was there, hoping that another employee would answer. Instead, the computer screen in the opposite room suddenly turned off, leaving the space completely dark. Feeling increasingly nervous, I decided to turn off the lights in my computer screen so as not to reveal my location. I bowed low and tiptoed into a nearby room, waiting in silence, not knowing what would happen next. The feeling of nervousness and fear made the time seem long, but finally, when I felt the coast was clear, I decided to leave the room. I tiptoed through the rooms until I reached the emergency exit and stairs. That's when I realized my scary suspicions had come true. There was a man crouching low behind a tree in the corner of the room, dressed all in black. My heart sank when I realized his presence. He seemed to have realized that I had seen him. Not daring to wait any longer, I turned back to the stairwell. Never again would I wait for the elevator in this situation. I opened the stairwell door and closed it behind me, then rushed down the stairs, running as fast as I could. The sound of the man's footsteps from above became increasingly clear and echoing. I felt a shock as I heard frantic footsteps speeding down the stairs, chasing me. Finally, I reached the first floor, ran through the lobby and out the front door. I don't see anyone following me. I immediately called the police and told one of my bosses. My boss confirmed that no one else was scheduled to work that night other than me. And when the police came to inspect the building from top to bottom, they found no trace of anyone else. I cannot provide any description other than that the man was dressed in black. After the incident, I continued to work the night shift for about a week, but the feeling of insecurity and fear never left me. My boss has given me permission to lock all entrances to the floors, including the elevator, but I still don't feel safe. Finally, I decided to switch to day shift because the anxiety and uncomfortable feelings could no longer be ignored. Story 8. The One Being Watched. One Saturday night, when the clock struck 4 a.m., I woke up hungry. The feeling of hunger made me unable to continue lying in bed, so I decided to get out of bed and go to the kitchen to make a sandwich. When I entered the kitchen, I immediately noticed something unusual. The cabinet door was wide open. As someone who is obsessed with closing everything I open, the presence of open cabinet doors makes me feel anxious. I can't believe I forgot to close it. For me, it's essential to check every nook and cranny of the house, as opposed to how most people might just close the cupboard and forget about it. I started checking around the house to see if there were any uninvited guests, but everything was normal and no one was there. I continued checking the closet, and when I went down to the office, I noticed the back door was wide open. Immediately, fear filled me. It seemed like someone had entered the house. The courage I tried to find to go outside and turn on the porch light. As the light from the lamp shined, I saw a man sitting on one of the porch chairs. This man seemed dirty, almost homeless. His hair was shoulder length, and his eyes were blank, looking at me with no discernible expression. As he slowly stood up, I felt a cold feeling rising inside me. I couldn't guess his intentions, and in a moment of panic, I stood there frozen, almost considering him a harmless part of the scene. However, my fake calm was quickly broken when the man suddenly rushed towards me. I barely had time to react to close the door and lock it. We stared at each other through the glass for 10 long seconds, and in that moment, I realized I needed to act immediately. Rushing into the kitchen, I quickly grabbed the phone and called the police. While I was dialing, I turned around and saw that the man had disappeared. My heart pounded when I couldn't see any trace of him. I kept calling the police and describing what I had seen, but when they arrived, there was no sign of the man. They searched around the house and surrounding area but found nothing. Even though the police didn't find anything, the feeling of insecurity still stuck with me. That night, I couldn't sleep, and this incident made me feel that my home was no longer safe. Story 9. Cold Hands. A few months ago, a strange and scary incident happened at the house where I still live. On a Monday night in February, I was sleeping peacefully when I was suddenly awakened by the loud alarm clock on my phone. It was still dark that night, and when I looked at the actual clock on my desk, the time read 4 a.m. I was confused as to why the alarm clock was going off at this time. I turned off the alarm and went back to sleep without thinking much about the matter. However, the next night, the incident happened again. I was woken up again by the alarm clock going off, this time at 3 a.m. The alarm's title is below, which strikes me as very odd, since I'm sure I didn't set that alarm. I thought maybe my brother was kidding me, so the next morning, I told my dad not to disturb my alarm clock because it interrupted my sleep during study nights. My dad swears he never touched my phone. I believed him, but the anxiety remained. To protect myself, I set a password on my phone and wrote it down on a sticky note, then hid the note on the wall behind my bed. I made sure not to set any more alarms and only kept one for 8 a.m. When I went to bed, I had a peaceful night until, once again, I was awakened by the alarm clock blasting into the darkness. This time it's 2 a.m. and the alarm's title is Bed. I feel very worried. It feels like something is really wrong with my phone. I suspect that someone hacked my phone. The next morning, I decided to stop using my phone for alarms and just use the actual alarm clock on my desk. However, when I woke up, it was still dark, and my alarm clock had gone off, making it impossible to tell the time. The sound of the alarm from the phone was not the same as usual, but emitted a distorted scream. I quickly turned off the alarm, seeing that the time was 1 a.m. At this moment, I felt extremely worried. My phone only had 10% battery left, so I reached under the bed to find the charger that's usually plugged into the wall, but it was missing. And this is when the worst truth was revealed. I realized that the 4 alarms formed a strange sentence under the bed. I tried to pull my hand away, but it was too late. A cold hand gripped my arm, and I screamed as loud as I could, loud enough for all the neighbors to hear. Hearing my screams, my parents quickly opened the door and ran to my room. My dad rushed in with a baseball bat, seeing me being pulled down to the edge of the bed. He reached under the bed and pulled out a man hiding under it. That man clearly had no intention of being discovered and locked himself under my bed for 4 days. My father used a stick to beat the man unconscious and called the police. When the police arrived, they informed us that this man was a registered sex offender, having been arrested 10 times before. His mind was extremely chaotic, and he clearly enjoyed causing trouble and scaring his victims. What scared me the most was knowing that he had been in the house and under my bed for 4 days without my knowledge. Story 10. Terrifying Call. One of the most terrifying experiences of my life was not an incident that happened directly to me, but an incident involving a friend with whom I was very close. I will call this friend Ty. We texted and saw each other often, but one day Ty suddenly didn't respond to any of my texts or calls. Worried, I decided to go to his house, just a block away. I knocked on the door and called his name, but there was no answer. This was strange because his car was still parked there. I feel like maybe he just wants to be alone. But this silence is suspicious. Late that night, I received a FaceTime call from an unknown number. Carefully, I answered with the camera pointed away from my face, not wanting to reveal my personal image. Immediately, a face appeared on the screen. I felt relieved when I realized it was Ty, but when I got a closer look, I noticed he looked a lot different, more tired, paler, and like he was in a strange room. I asked where Ty was and why he hadn't responded to my messages. He said he was fine and at home. I asked him whose phone he used, and he hesitated for a long time before answering that it was his uncle's phone. This was really strange, but before I could ask any more, Ty suddenly asked me to borrow $10,000 from him and promised to pay it back later. I couldn't help but laugh at this request, but when I saw his serious and worried expression, I started to feel uneasy. I asked why he needed such a large amount of money, but there was a long pause while Ty just stared blankly at the camera. Finally, he said he had to go and the call ended abruptly. This is one of the strangest and scariest things I have ever experienced. I had never seen Ty act so oddly before, and something was clearly wrong with him. The next morning, I went straight to Ty's house and rang the bell about 10 times, but no one answered. I felt stuck and decided to give up, thinking maybe it was just his problem. But late at night, at the same time, I received another FaceTime call from another unknown number. I answered, and this time, Ty's face looked much more miserable. His hair was messy. There was a cut on his forehead, and the dark circles under his eyes made him look extremely tired. I couldn't understand what was happening to Ty. He repeatedly asked me to send $10,000 to a random address I didn't know. Even though I refused, he started talking in a nervous and shaky voice, then suddenly said something that made me feel like I was being stabbed in the heart. "Don't point the gun at my back." This statement came as a shock to me, and when Ty ended the call abruptly, I could only imagine what had happened to him. With extreme anxiety, I memorized the address Ty requested and sent the police there immediately. When the police arrived, they discovered an old abandoned house miles from my house. In terrible condition, they found Ty beaten, unconscious, and barely alive. At that moment, they discovered that the sick man who caused these injuries to Ty had long since died. Ty said he was held captive in a dark basement and woke up there after being assaulted. This incident made me feel haunted and scared. It's horrible to think that my friend went through such a nightmare and I couldn't help in time. When the last light fades and darkness takes over, the memories of what you just experienced will not fade easily. Whispers in the night, haunting images, and a cold feeling that clings will follow you to sleep. Remember, sometimes what you don't see is the scariest thing, and in your dreams you may meet the characters that made you shiver. Be careful, because the darkness never completely disappears.